This is a video about the renowned Grayling fisherman of Yorkshire. And first is a quote from the Field magazine in 2009. Best to concentrate on the greats from the past who loved Grayling, Halford especially. Carter Platt, John Roberts, Reggie Regini, Terry Thomas, T.K. Wilson, Dick Walker, Fred Buller, Hugh Falkus, and those with a brain who fish today, maestros such as Charles Raisley Wilson and Howard Croston. The list of lovers is endless. Join it. There are thousands of books devoted to trout and salmon fishing, but few to that other member of the salmonid family, the Grayling. The earliest book devoted to Yorkshire grayling fishing was by John Jackson. It was called the Practical Fly Fisher, more particularly for grayling or umber. And he was born at Massam Mill, where he spent his childhood before moving to become the miller at Tanfield Mill, just up the river, where he spent the rest of his life and dying at an early age in 1863. And there's an old map where you can see Tanfield Mill is here. This is West Tanfield. This is Tanfield Mill, and this is Slenningford Mill. It's a rather grand house now. Somebody bought it and renovated it. Very posh. Working and living on the banks of the River York, it was almost inevitable that he would become a fisherman. He was well known amongst the many who came to fish the York and its tributaries, most of whom were the wealthy business classes from the industrial conurbations who came to fish the rivers owned by the landed gentry. I mean, many of these estates were far too expensive for their old families, and eventually they were bought up by the nouveau riche, who took up country pursuits, including fishing. Like most of that era, John Jackson, he wasn't very well educated, but he had a wealth of knowledge, which was recognised by a chap called Thomas Hanley Barker, who was a surgeon, and he was a member of the Yorkshire Philosophical Society, and he lived at Hoffingham, where the Worsleys' big estate was. And the Yorkshire Philosophical Society, their primary aim was to promote public understanding and involvement in the academic disciplines of the natural and social sciences. It's still thriving, and the website is very interesting. But the great and the good of the day, they all belong to these philosophical societies. So the sort of upper echelons of Yorkshire society, the men anyway, they belong to the YPS. And Barker was born in Massam, obviously to a well-to-do family, but obviously well-educated, becoming a surgeon, where, when he was a young boy, he made the acquaintance of John Jackson through fishing, and he persuaded Jackson to put his knowledge down on paper. I mean, as Jackson wrote to T.H. Barker in his introduction to the book, "Esteemed friend, in compliance with your desire, and at the solicitation of several kind friends, I am induced to attempt laying down a few observations, the results of long experiences in fly fishing, which more especially in that department of the gentle art which relates to grayling or umber. Should any information I may be able to give add to your previous knowledge or contribute to your future pleasure, I shall be highly gratified." I'm not sure he wrote that. It doesn't sound like the language of a miller. It's a small book of just 58 pages, 30 of them given over to fly patterns and when to use them. Yeah, and it mentions a strange fly, a whirling blue dun. I've never heard of it before. It was intended that Jackson would describe the rivers Yore, Ayr, Wharfe and Rye, but he died in 1863 at an early age, before it was completed. The remainder of the book, and the most interesting to me, was written by Barker, who describes in considerable detail the fishing in 3 of the rivers, with particular reference to the various landowners whose permission had to be sought before fishing. And as he says, usually through his lordship's agents. Yeah. It's an era which disappeared between World War I and II. They just didn't have the money to carry on as they were. Publishing a book was a very expensive business, and you needed subscribers, people who had money and who were given a free copy and had their names listed in the book. A measure of the esteem John Jackson was held in can be seen in the list of the subscribers for this little volume. It reads like a who-who of Yorkshire's sporting gentlemen, including lords, dukes. I mean, it was the Duke of Leeds, and many esquires. These were sort of people of sort of high social standing. It was also published by Farlow's, a sort of London. I mean, they're a very prestigious company, and they're still there in Pall Mall. Farlow's of Pall Mall. It's worth having a look in, but buy. It's an expensive place. Thus, Thomas Hanley Barker saved John Jackson's lifetime knowledge for our benefit. I mean, how many other John Jacksons were there whose experiences just disappeared with them? Anyway, this is what Barker says about a good Grayling river. He should have 4 requisites. First, a moderately warm temperature of the external air on the water. And secondly, a particular chemical composition of the water. I think he favours sort of limestone. And thirdly, a mixture of pool and stream. And last but not least, a cultivated country through which it runs. And T.H. Barker describes the River Rye as the best Grayling river I know. And he'd done a lot of fishing, particularly in the north of England. I mean, he fished the Tweed, so he was obviously well-heeled and well-connected. Then there was a gap. Nothing happened, or nothing followed, until 1888, when along came this man, Thomas Evans Pritt, with his waxed moustache. He was born near Preston in Lancashire in May 1848, and he moved to Leeds in 1874, where he was a bank manager. I think he eventually founded his own bank. And he lived in a rather grand house in Headingley, which is still there. And that is it today. I wonder if they know that Thomas Evans Pritt lived in their house. He soon became involved with the Leeds angling fraternity, became a sort of an adopted Yorkshireman. And he wrote articles as the angling editor for the Yorkshire Weekly Post from 1884 until his early death in 1895. He was a great raconteur and was in big demand as an after-dinner speaker. His wry, and some might say disrespectful sense of humour made his angling column very popular, and not just with anglers. He's best remembered for 2 books. The first one was North Country Flies, which was published in 1886, and more relevant to this video, the Book of the Grayling, published in 1888, and it was reprinted, minus the prints, in 2013. This is frequently described as the quintessential book on fishing for grayling. The hand-painted plate of the grayling on the front is super, but like most books of that era, the coloured plates of the flies leave much to the imagination. They're all a little bit blurred. Like Walbrun, he was a fly fisherman, as exemplified by this short passage from his book on grayling, where he dismisses the angler who fishes with maggots. And the maggot, because this kind of fishing as practised on certain northern rivers is to be discouraged as much as possible. The man who wanders forth in search of a game and handsome fish like the grayling, armed with quarts of maggots for ground baiting purposes, is not a sportsman. He's a fish catcher, and ought to be suppressed in every club to which he is accidentally admitted. Strong words. His three top flies were Crimson Tag, Dark Needle and Fog Black. Nevertheless, in the coldest of months he resorted to trotting a small red worm, which he describes in some detail, the most interesting being an experienced hand fishing down a mile or two of river will have 20 brace of good fish in the course of 3 hours in the afternoon of a winter's day. That's 40 fish. The thing about these people, they killed everything they caught and dished it out to their sort of friends and proprietors of hotels they stayed in, and he goes on to say, at the riverside the call becomes imaginary and winter flies away, but it is a sport for hardy men, not for effeminate nincompoops. Unlike his younger contemporary Walbrun, he disdains whisky for his flask, recommending hot sweet tea, especially in winter. And he mentions the merits of the grayling as a culinary delight several times, and includes a recipe on the final page of his book. And in the year Thomas Pritt died, the next book was published by this man, Francis Maximilian Walbrun, an imposing looking figure. And this is a photograph obviously taken in a photographer's studio, posing with all his paraphernalia. A painted backdrop, typical of that era. He was born in September 1851, and his father was a wine merchant. And he wrote for the Fishing Gazette, the Leeds Mercury, the Field Magazine, and numerous others. And he lived at Ivy Cottage, at Poole in Wharfdale. It had at one time been a pub, and there's a photograph of it. It's a rather grand looking house as well. In 1883 he revised Theakston's classic book, A List of Natural Flies, and he published it as British Angling Flies. And then in 1892 he founded Tanfield Angling Club. He was a bit worried about the effect the railway was going to have on the fishing, bringing lots of people in from elsewhere. He also founded the London Fly Fishers Club. And he was a friend of Holford, who was the sort of father of the dry fly, and of Skews, who pioneered fishing with nymphs and the wet fly, much to Holford's disgust. The Fly Fishers Club now meets in the Savile Club in Brook Street in London. So he moved in elite circles. Having been a pharmacist in 1884, he started his own business with a fishing tackle shop, Northern Anglers Depot at 10 New Station Street in Leeds. But it was a failed venture, and it was taken over by somebody called J.E. Miller. And the story is that Miller, being a friend of Walbrun's, he took it on to help him out. And this is an advert for the shop after Miller took it over, which appeared in the back of Rolt's book, Grayling Fishing in Southern Streams. In the 1901 census, he was in lodgings with his sons, but in Rolt's book, Grayling Fishing in Southern Country Streams, published in 1905, there's an advert for Walbrun Limited, Leeds, at 33A Wellington Street, just round the corner from his old shop, which wouldn't have endeared him to his friend J. Miller. I wonder if they fell out. It too seems to have been a failure, and Walbrun was facing financial ruin at the time of his demise, and it led to sort of several unsubstantiated rumours about his death. And there is said advertisement from Rolt's book. He continued to make a living by writing for newspapers and magazines, his pen name being Halcyon, and in 1895 he published his most well-known book, Grayling and How to Catch Them. It's a small tome of only 142 pages, and very expensive to buy if you want an original, but like most of these books, it was reprinted in 2016. And in the book, he extols the virtues of the grayling. This is a quote from the book. October, November and December are my favourite angling months. For is it not then that the graceful gliding grayling is in his prime, when he rises freely or capriciously, as the case may be, at the fluttering willow flies or the autumn duns, when he gently stops the tiny float of the hardy winter angler, and when his game struggles and bold attempts for freedom are second to no fish that inhabits the British waters, his spotted relative not even accepted. A grand statement. There are several articles of his angling experiences in which he mentions large catches of grayling. In Christmas week in 1886, he caught 85 on the wharf. On another occasion, he had 38. I mean, this was not unusual. In freezing weather, having caught 20 in next to no time, he stumbled and fell into the freezing water, and he downed half a pint of brandy he just happened to have in his flask to recover. He often stayed at the Bruce Arms at West Tanfield, enjoying the victuals and liquor, as he says in his book. A 3 miles walk and we are at home once more, for is not the Bruce Arms as good as such to be? For more than 25 years have I been accustomed to abide there, and now I am almost seem to be part of the household. I mean, read into that what you will. And he told Thomas Pritt that his 3 favourite grayling flies were red tag, sea swallow and water hen. A sea swallow, I've discovered, is a common tern. It's very ironic that his long-suffering wife often berated him about his dying by drowning, which is exactly what happened. In February 1909, he fell into the icy waters of the River Yore at West Tanfield and he was drowned. Anyway, they found his body and they laid him out in the Bruce Arms, and he's buried in West Tanfield churchyard. And this next little piece of video is about that. This is the River Ure at West Tanfield. You can see the Marmion Tower and the church there. And this is where Francis Maximilian Walbrun died. He drowned in the river here. He was wading when, well, the argument was he was wading when there was too much current. There was all sorts of other speculation. He had a business, an angling business in Leeds, and they reckon it was on his beam ends he was about bust. But he was quite a ruthless sort of person. I'm just looking down here, there's a sizable number of fish rising here today. Oh, over there. What is that grayling? So this is a view from the Marmion Tower looking at the bridge over the River Ure at West Tanfield. And the church is just on my left, here. Where Francis Maximilian Walbrun is buried. We'll go and have a look for his grave in a moment. And this is his gravestone in West Tanfield churchyard. Unfortunately, it's the lighting's not very good. It was raised by subscription. When word got round that he'd died, then people subscribed to this stone, which is sort of flaking away. And there you can see the sort of creel, rods, 3 fishes. I don't know, it's a bait bucket or what it is, really. That was it. Yeah, my voluntary subscription. Could really do with all sort of cleaning out, I suspect. So we can read it, and there's another sort of inscription down here which I can't read either. His body was found in the river, and he was brought here to the Bruce Arms where he was laid out before his burial. And this is Walbrun's grave in West Tanfield churchyard. This gravestone with various inscriptions on which we'll have a look at. Erected by voluntary subscription to the memory of Francis Maximilian Walbrun, who was accidentally drowned whilst angling at Tanfield on February the 1st, 1909, aged 57 years. And there shall the toiler find rest from his labour. When memory is bright, streams shall become but a rill. When the rude hand of toil shall spare not his neighbour, the voice of the river shall sing to him still. The bottom of the plinth is the fishing, which is net, creel, rods and 3 fish. Yeah, rather nice. Although gradually becoming obscured by lichen, which will eventually eat away at it. can see there where the whole stone is beginning to crumble away after 100 years, or 108 years in fact. There is West Anfield Church at 12:30 in the afternoon, and there is Francis Walbrun's grave. I noticed that in these early books there's no mention of the tying silk colours in the flying tying instructions. Although more of a coarse fisherman and not strictly a Grayling angler, nor indeed a Yorkshireman, I've included the next chap as the greatest influence on angling, which carried on to this day, and not just in Yorkshire. And there's his portrait again, a waxed moustache of the time. And there's a photograph of him in action. It looks like he's trotting or something. Yeah, he reminds me of somebody, but no names. His CV was amazing. He was born in Gloucester in 1872 and fished the Severn for a number of years. He was a school teacher, and he moved to teach in Leeds, and he too became an adopted Yorkshireman. In 1909 he wrote a sort of pamphlet, Great Northern Railway, a guide to angling resorts. He was a member of the Robin Hood Angling Club. I'm assuming the Robin Hood was a pub somewhere. And he was president of the National Federation of Anglers from 1913 right through to 1925. He was the only person to win the All England Championship twice. And he was a member of the Leeds All England team winners in 1909, 1910, 1914, and then again 14 years later in 1928. He won the Leeds Dasser First Prize in 1903 and 1907 again in 1909 at Kirkstead. I don't think they've got that water now. And again he was at it in 1922 and 1926 at Acaster. And then lastly in 1927 at Dunsworth. He was a contributor to the Fishing Gazette, Anglers News and the Yorkshire Evening Post. His book, The Art of Coarse Fishing, which was published in 1932, is his best known, and it has a chapter on fishing for Grayling, not particularly notable. Although his celebrity status emanates from his exploits in the world of coarse fishing, his little book, Fun with a Fishing Rod, published shortly after his death, concentrates on fishing for grayling and trout in the upper reaches of the Ure, Wharf and Nid, albeit with maggot and worm. And there's some really funny anecdotes in that little book, and it's easy to get hold of. Very humorous. And he mentions big catches of grayling. On page 75, I went away to the upper Ure to endeavour to extract a share of the grayling from its well-stocked waters. On page 81, I had a dozen and about the same number of days in just about half an hour. And again on page 86. The grayling was certainly not ravenous, and it took quite an hour and a half to collect a dozen that I wanted. But they were all a good size, averaging about 12 ounces each. In mixed bags of 40 and 50 trout, grayling and chub, as a matter of course. Well, what's happened since then? On one occasion, he caught 161 grayling in 12 and a half hours bank fishing. Crikey. During the Great War, he travelled by train to Masham in the company of military folk going to the Leeds Powell's training camp at Colsterdale. An officer, Sir Charles Wilson, asked him if he could provide some grayling for the camp, and he would send a car to the station to pick them up. Anyway, Jim Beasley, he'd caught 35. Some of his record-breaking fishing took place at Hornsey Mere, in the East Riding of Yorkshire. In 1919, he caught 50 roach over 2 pounds from Hornsey Mere. I mean, a 2 pound roach today is a lifetime fish. He also caught a 30 pound pike from the same water. And like most anglers at that time, he killed it and took it back to Leeds on a train when it was laid out in the Anglers Club for all to see. He died in 1933, having caught a chill when fishing on the River Yore, and he's buried in Horsforth Cemetery with a rather splendid stone, I understand, although I can't find any record of it on the internet. But he was the coarse fishing mentor of this man. Reggie Regini. A photograph of him fishing. Long trotting for grayling, that was what he was into. Although he was a wonderful fly fisherman and fly tyer, very intelligent man. He was born in Bradford on the 27th of June 1912, and his father was a French army officer who was killed in World War I, and that's how he comes to have that unusual surname. It's not exactly West Yorkshire. And he was brought up by his Yorkshire mother and his grandparents, and he made a fortune as a broker in the Bradford Wool Exchange. Unlike many in Bradford at that time who preferred Rolls Royces, I mean in the 1950s and 60s, per head of population, Bradford had the greatest number of Rolls Royces in the world. Changed days. Reggie Regini, he had an expensive Bristol motor car. I like to think it was the 401 sports car. It was a snazzy looking thing. He was a leading light or instrumental in establishing the Grayling Society. And as I've said earlier, his coarse fishing mentor was the great J.H.R. Basley, or Baisley is it pronounced? And he wrote extensively for the angling press. And although this is not about grayling, one of his famous books is Salmon Taking Times. And it was first published in 1965. It was highly praised by the magazine Field, and the second edition is freely available, easy to find. And this is a little quote. What makes a salmon take a lure? Are the responsive moods of salmon predictable? These are the fundamental questions which Salmon Taking Times sets out to answer. The author asserts that the most important single factor affecting changes in the salmon's behaviour is the supply of oxygen. It follows that the successful angler must pay the closest attention to variations in the atmospheric conditions which cause variations in the oxygen content of the water. With an introduction by Bernard Venables and a commentary by Terry Thomas. Contents include Section 1, Salmon Taking Times, When and Why Salmon Take, Anticipating Taking Times, the Principal Weather and Water Factors, Taking Time Patterns, Seasonal Factors, Subsidiary Indications, and then Section 2, Reading River Currents, the Behaviour of Water, Glides, Runs and Streams, Use of the Current, Changing levels of the river, where salmon lie, tributaries and confluences, and then in Section 3, greased fly line section, policy about that, colour and form, size and weight of the fly, fly design, and then Section 4, more problems. The range of vision of the salmon, change over from sunk line to grease line, running salmon, spinning, and my current problem. So it's a very comprehensive book. I've not read it. His best known book is called simply Grayling, and it was published in 1968. And this book elevated the grayling to its rightful place as a sporting fish. It's not too difficult to find, but it's becoming expensive. And it's essential reading for anglers who fish for grayling in North Country rivers. I mean, many anglers long trot for grayling on northern rivers, and it's much neglected in angling books, but Reggie Regini, he sets the record straight. And I love this quote from his book. The best days are not remembered individually, but merge into a pleasant, gratifying general picture of beautiful valleys and streams, bulging rises to the fly, floats darting away beneath the surface, and a magnificent colouring of grayling against the background of snow or red-brown falling leaves. The acceptability of the 6-hour-old tea from the flask, sipped during a few minutes' cheerful gossip with another rod, and the delightful contentment during the unhurried trudge back to the road when another wonderful day on the river is ending in the darkness. Well, that sums it up. And that famous angler, Richard Walker, he says, no previous writer on the subject has shown such complete understanding of the nature and behaviour of this species, nor of the exploitation of modern tackle and methods for its capture. A good book on grayling that covers both fly and float fishing methods. Chapters include getting to know the grayling, dry fly considerations, phases of dry fly fishing, some wet fly problems, and phases of wet fly and nymph fishing. And then something which there's a lot of in this area, long trotting. Equipment and baits, long trotting practical problems, conditions for long trotting episodes, and then there are appendices on length to weight ratios of grayling, float mating, gathering gilt-tailed worms, grayling cookery and more. But unlike almost all other books on grayling fishing, there's no details of fly patterns in the book. He wasn't satisfied with the floats available for long trotting, so he designed one himself, and he goes into it in considerable detail in his book with some photographs, and you can still get it. I think the Grayling Society still sell it. Reggie Regini, he's not a great lover of maggots, preferring gilt-tails. a small red worm. I've never identified exactly what it is, but it has a pale yellowish tail, and this last little bit of video is about my search for one. Well, I've never seen a photograph, not even a drawing, of one of these gilt-tail worms that Reggie Regini waxes lyrical about, and others speak very highly of them. But no visual evidence in any books. So today's venture is to go to the garden where there are lots of earthworms, collect a few and try and identify this 2-inch long earthworm with a small yellowish tail. Well, the first thing we need is some moss to keep them in. There's plenty of that in the garden. Not loose. Well, this is a pile of grass cuttings. They're supposed to like living grass cuttings. Let's rake over this pile here and see what we get. Well, there are lots of earthworms, but is there a gilt-tail amongst them? I'll collect them and take them inside and have a look. And T.K. Wilson, in his book, and I'll read it, for dead slow waters, my standby is the gilt-tailed worm. A small worm general to compost heaps. Then he goes on to say, their colour is murky and somewhat varied, but if you keep them in moss for a day or two, they scour a striking coral colour. Tending to be on the sluggish side, they liven up on being impaled on the hook. And what is this gilt-tailed worm? Well, John Roberts, he mentions them in his book as well, and he says the best two worms are gilt-tails or brandlings. Well, brandlings are quite easy to identify because they have a sort of dark and light bands on them, but gilt-tails, nothing. So I've collected a lot of worms from the garden, from all over, compost heaps, piles of grass cuttings, the old potato patch, the lawn, and I'm going to have a look at them today, and that's what this is about, the pursuit of the gilt-tailed worm. Well, this is a lobworm. As you can see, it's a great big thing, difficult to keep them steady. And all mature earthworms have this saddle, so anything without the saddle isn't a mature earthworm. The gilt-tail's only supposed to be about 2 inches long, and sometimes only an inch. But I can't find any mature worms which are as small as that. That one there is about the smallest there is. The others mature worms are all larger than that. thing is there a gilt-tail amongst them? To be quite honest, I don't think the Grayling would care less, as long as it's a wiggly worm. Anyway, further investigation has come up with this earthworm, Icenia venata. You can see there, it's got a gilt tail. That's that one that's there. And that one there. And they're small. They're called compost worms. There are lots of things very, very similar. But is that the gilt tail of Reggie Regini? Well, I can't find any others. There's some very similar, you know, sort of 2-3 inches long, but they don't have that gilt tail. That's what it's called. Icenia venata. The compost worm. Actually, it's one of several compost worms. The last publication was called Fishing Reflections, Thoughts on Salmon, Trout and Grayling Fishing, and it was published in 1995, long after his death in 1987. And it's an anthology of his essays and magazine articles, and it's an easy find. It's freely available on the internet. Whilst researching the anglers I mentioned above, I noticed they came from wealthy families and were well connected to landed families with estates and wonderful rivers. I mean, being well educated, they were literate, unlike most of the population, giving them the confidence not only necessary in business, but the confidence to express their ideas and opinions in print. They became wealthy themselves, enabling them to travel by train or trap and car and stay in hotels. And this photograph from the 1930s, which appeared in the Yorkshire Post, it says a lot. Note the chauffeur. They were the days. Or not, depending on your status in society. I wonder what the chauffeur thought of it all. And the next book, specifically about Grayling, was written by John Roberts. And it was called The Grayling Angler, and it was published in 1982. Again, it's easy to find, but prices are going up and up and up. Almost all authors of angling books lean heavily on the works of their predecessors and update them, and this is no exception. It's a more technical book than many which have gone before, but it's a useful addition to the Grayling fishing library. It's not strictly about North Country rivers, it covers a much broader range of rivers, including some in Yorkshire, for they tend to be the more prestigious rivers of the Yorkshire Wolds. Sort of Driffield Beck comes to mind. And there's a list of flights as long as your arm with coloured illustrations. I mean, they were probably state of the art in 1982, but they lack the sharpness of modern plates, which are outstanding. Where it does excel is in the chapter on bait fishing. Roberts writes about it on its merits without the sort of slight inferiority to fly fishing which is apparent in earlier books. For the first time we see descriptions of fly fishing using strike indicators, and there's a useful section on shot link ledgering for those grayling which cannot be reached with either the fly or the float. I mean, both of these methods would have been an anathema even to Reggie Regini. He mentions huge bags of grayling. I mean, Francis, who was a southern country angler between 1822 and 1886, talking about the success of the grasshopper fly. It looks now like a grasshopper. He talks of baskets of 25 to 30 pound, emptied 3 times a day by a single rod, and they were probably all killed as well. And Roberts himself mentioned 63 fish in 4 hours before he had to leave early. But he says he only kept 2. In 1999 he published Fly Fishing for Grayling in a sort of limited run of 1,250 books, and it's a softback. It has 150 pages, and again it's not too difficult to find, but like many of these books, the price is rocketing. And this is the contents, which are quite interesting. You know, grayling, a personal view, the facts of life, habitat distribution, life cycle, food, caddies, shrimps, midges, terrestrials, reed smuts, stonefly, Ephemeroptera, and then fly fishing methods, dry fly fishing, the Klinghauer special, it's the first time it's been mentioned. Fishing the caddis hatches, fancy dry flies, again the first time they've been mentioned as well. Grayling not too worried about natural representations, they'll have a go at anything. Dry fly presentations, subsurface fly fishing, and then we come to bug fishing, the leadhead nymph, fishing the caseless caddis, and again new Polish and Czech short nymphing, traditional nymphing, wet flies and spiders, minor tactics, recommended grayling flies, and Appendix A, a list of grayling livers in Britain, and Appendix B, a bit about grayling growth rates and the Grayling Society, and then there's a bibliography at the end. So obviously the bait fishing section of the earlier book is missing, but much is taken from the earlier book. As I said before, the really interesting parts are the sections on the more recent, very successful fancy flies using modern materials and heavy nymphs fished short, Polish or Czech style, which took the fly fishing world by storm when the Czech and Polish anglers cleaned up at the world champions for 3 successive years before everybody else caught up. His book, A Guide to River Trout Flies, was first published in 1989. Is a follow-on from Courtney Williams' classic, which was published in 1950. New materials included and illustrations are far, far better, but they still lack the clarity of more recent books. Each fly has a little history alongside the materials list, which adds to its merits. And at the end of the book there is a section on grayling flies, which is interesting. And in 1980, as he says, he invented the dove bug, a northern version of Sawyer's killer bug, but not so fussy about the materials used. And it's a grayling fly I assume he uses on, or used on the Yorkshire river dove, which comes down from the North York moors through Farndale of daffodil fame and joins the River Rye. And there it is. William Nelson, who was not strictly a Yorkshire angler, but he fished the River Eden and the River Emont, which are North Country rivers. He has a chapter on grayling fishing in his book, Fishing in Eden, which was published in 1922. Again, a very difficult book to get hold of. But it's more anecdotal than instructional, and it's a delightful, easy read. He fished the rivers Eden and Emont, which are both North Country rivers, for more than 50 years. And after his death, Arthur Ransom wrote a 4-page obituary of him in his book, Rod and Line, in which he mentions that Nelson, on being asked to write a book on grayling fishing, had declined, lest people should think he was trying to supersede Pritt's classic. Well, what a shame. It was a loss. And original copies of most of the books mentioned above are hundreds of pounds, assuming you can find a copy. But much cheaper facsimiles are readily available. And there are other publications about grayling, notable being Huddersfield's W. Carterplatt's book, Grayling Fishing. It was published in 1939, just before the Second World War. It's an excellent read, but Yorkshire rivers, they just take up a small part of the book. And there's a chapter on swimming in the worm, which is very relevant to Yorkshire rivers. But the most interesting section deals with netting. These are a few quotes from the book. In November 1936, the Yorkshire Fishery Board netted 1,170 grayling out of the Golden Hill water in Driffield and released them into club waters on the Wharf and Swale. Also, they liberated 200 in the Nid. In August and September 1937, they netted out of the Yore at Wensley and Middleham 400 grayling, which were transferred to club waters on the Swale and Nid. And then again, in October 1937, they netted out of the wharf at Burnsall 500 grayling, running from 4 ounces to 10 ounces, which were turned out in club waters on the lower reaches of the river. And then this statement. In October and November 1937, they netted out of the famous Driffield stream 2,400 excellent grayling, nearly half of which were a pound or over, and these were transported to waters of the Leeds Anglers Amalgamation on the Nid and Wharf. Well, nothing like that number there in the Nid and Wharf now. I've noticed a fair number of typing errors on there. My apologies.